Central Europe, northern Lower Saxony. Summer work during the heather flow in a Skep Apiary. At the beginning of August, the Skep apiarists at Klintwort's commercial bee farm in Langenfelde near Sittensen have only a short time to examine the total stock of skeps. Since the end of the swarming time, they have assembled about 1,500 heather honeybee colonies on several large outstands. 100 skeps are positioned on the stand at Twistenbostel, about 18 kilometers from the bee farm. The bees in the newly reared cast colonies and the original stocks have increased in the skeps during the past 6 to 8 weeks and built out their combs. The beekeepers are taking an inventory of the state of their stocks, while at the same time preparing them for the migration to the chief honey flow of the year. The colonies should consist of as many workers as possible to optimize the yield of nectar and pollen. That is why the apiarists pay special attention to the state of the combs. Any queen cells laid down in the meantime, and all drone comb sections are removed. The reason is that drones and new queens are superfluous in a colony with a mated queen. Drone comb is often built up right into the crown of the skep. By cutting it out, the beekeeper encourages the bees to build out new combs, which they can then fill with stores. After inspection, the skeps are covered with light cloths which allow air to circulate. They are to be transferred this very evening. Besides the young master beekeeper, Georg Klintwort Jr., the two assistant beekeepers, Elke Bullmann and August von Bargen, are at work here. All available staff at the bee farm have to join in this major operation. After a while, the master beekeeper himself, Georg Klintwort Sr., joins them. At the time of filming, he was 71 years of age. He started beekeeping with only 70 winter colonies 50 years previously. The empty feeding dishes are now laid aside. The apiarists had encouraged the development of their stocks after the swarming period by feeding them sugar syrup. In the pieces of comb removed, one can see drones in all stages of development. Fully developed drones, just about to emerge from their cells, and larvae. Without being fed by the nurse bees, they will soon die. The pieces of comb are meticulously collected together. As soon as the beekeepers find time, they will be pressed to summer wax. In several skeps, the combs have been built down as far as the feeding dish. Straws, which serve the bees as landing places in it, are also removed. By blowing smoke from his pipe and by tapping lightly, the beekeeper makes the bees detach themselves from the combs. It is important to work quietly and gently to avoid frightening the bees. With the narrow blade of his long-handled skep knife, or with the hook at the other end, the beekeeper can work deep inside the skep and fetch out the smallest pieces without damaging the adjacent comb surfaces. The square gauze cloths have to be pulled tight round the perimeter of the skep to prevent the bees escaping from the basket in transit. Occasionally, the beekeeper comes across weak colonies like this one that have not built out their combs beyond the first pair of spiles. As it is not worthwhile taking a stock like this to the heather, he leaves the skep open. In addition, he marks it with a twig or with a wooden sticker. The 4 beekeepers required about 2 hours to process the 100 skeps standing here. After a short break, they will proceed to the next outstand. The entrances remain open right up to the moment of dispatch to allow the bees unobstructed entry and exit during the day. For stuffing the entrance holes, the beekeeper is looking for suitable pieces of moss in the vicinity of the stand. He places it ready in spaces on the shelves. On other stands, he makes use of grass as well. Immediately before transport, the entrances are sealed tight after the bees have been driven back into the skeps by smoking. Bees which were still out foraging will beg their way into other colonies and thereby increase their strength. The skeps are stacked close together on their sides in staggered formation. Sudden movements and rolling from side to side have to be avoided so that the bees do not panic and the basket work of the skeps is not damaged. As the comb sections are arranged vertically, jolts during transport can be quite well absorbed. The entrance holes are always on top. The gauze cloths allow free exchange of air and thus ensure the necessary temperature equalization. The small number of skeps left on the outstands will be collected up to enable the beekeepers to look after them more easily on one stand. Very weak colonies are united or later added to another colony. The destination of the summer migration is the Lüneburg Heath, because this is one of the only areas where large expanses of heather have survived. The beekeepers have to travel anything from 60 to 120 kilometers to get there. This long-distance migration did not become necessary until 30 years ago. Up until 1955, there were sufficient heathlands in the vicinity of the home farm. In those days, the skeps were transported by horse and cart. After a 2-hour journey, the first migration stand is set up on the heath in the evening hours. The heather stands are vital to the Skep apiarist. All his efforts so far this year have been directed at getting the bees to harvest heather honey. All the foraging, the feeding to tide over gaps in nectar flow, and all the other beekeeping measures have served to increase the number of colonies and to promote their development up to the heather flowering time. The beekeeper built the stands himself several decades ago. To protect them against wind and rain, they are often located on the edge of a coppice. They are aligned east or southeast so that the skeps catch the earliest sunshine. Anything between 50 and 100 skeps can be accommodated on one heather outstand. This far excels the capacity of the small migration stands used in the orchards of the Altersland. The entrance holes are opened immediately the skeps have been set up. This enables the bees to orientate on their first foraging flights early the following morning. A second heather outstand is filled with the skeps loaded near Twistenbostel. Both stands are situated in the southern part of the Lüneburg Heath near Meinholz. Several evenings in a row, the Klintwort bee farm transports its skeps to the heather until all the available standing grounds are occupied. Most of them lie in an area reserved for military training. The experienced migratory beekeeper times the migration in accordance with the heather nectar flow. He does not set up his colonies on the heath until the heather starts flowering. This usually occurs by the 10th of August. After the shake-up during transportation, the bees need some time to settle down in the skeps and get accustomed to the new location. When the master beekeeper visits his stands the following day, he takes care to protect himself very well at first. There must not be a single gap between veil and jacket. The woven horsehair panel of the veil is provided with a leather-lined opening for the beekeeper's pipe. Up until the time when the heather is in full blossom and nectar flow, the bees need feeding to tide them over the gap. A shortage of food would impair the queen's laying activity and endanger the brood in the nest. And as one has to reckon with substantial bee losses in the heather anyway, lack of food would considerably weaken the stocks. The beekeeper provides the bees with food at the same time as he removes the covering cloths. On the home stands, he uses feeding dishes and wooden platters for the sugar syrup or honey water, but here, on the migration stands, the single portion of candy is simply placed on a piece of plastic foil. On a hot August day like this, the beekeeper cannot hold out long under his veil. He takes advantage of the opportunity to stuff his pipe again. Dried tansy leaves are used for this purpose. Each colony receives a portion of about 2 pounds of sugar candy. This bee food takes some time for the bees to assimilate, so they have provisions for several days without a surplus of food occurring, which the bees would put away in their combs. It has taken the beekeeper an hour and a half to perform all the tasks at this stand. The covering cloths are kept bundled up until they are taken home again. A fortnight later, in the second half of August, the heather is in full bloom. In good weather, the bees now find plenty of pollen and nectar in the blossoms of Calluna vulgaris, the heather. Every 3 or 4 days, the beekeeper does the rounds of his 15 heather outstands to inspect the state of the stocks, as here near the small town of Dorfmark. During the 2 weeks since the beginning of the heather migration, the bees in this skep have drawn their combs almost down as far as the shelf of the stand. In sampling the skeps, the beekeeper is keen to see whether the bees are already storing honey. If a poorly built-out comb structure indicates that a colony is weak, he places the skep where a well-built-out skep had stood, with a view to increasing its bee population. The weaker colony is strengthened by the foragers of the previous strong stock returning to their accustomed location. To optimize the honey harvest, all the skeps should be equally populous and well built out. The most favorable arrangement is for the migration stands to be in the center of the best foraging area and not too close together. The fact is that large, continuous areas of heather, like this one on the Raarberg slopes, are becoming less and less common in the Lüneburg heath these days. Grasses and birch trees are proliferating since sheep grazing has been on the decline. Especially in the military training areas, which occupy a major part of the heath, woodlands are gradually taking over. To avoid over-foraging the heather crop, the migration beekeeper has to obtain a new license every year from the local authority responsible for the area, permitting him to use the stands and stipulating the number of skeps he may set here. So, migration stand number 61, in the administrative district of Soltau-Fallingbostel, is licensed for 100 skep colonies. Heather produces better nectar if the soil is poor in humus and relatively heavy. But weather conditions before and during the flowering period are also a decisive factor. Temperatures of around 20 degrees centigrade and morning mists are favorable for nectar and pollen gathering. But if long periods of low temperatures and drought prevail, or cold, rainy conditions endure, the bees will start to eat up their stores of honey. That is why the beekeeper makes sure, during each inspection round, that they are continuing to lay up stores, and he checks how well the honey cells are being filled. The skeps have been standing in the heather for 3.5 weeks now. If favourable conditions endure, the beekeeper will let his bees work for him for a further week, before taking the stocks back to the bee farm around the 15th of September. In a good summer, the skeps on the heather outstands have increased in weight by as much as 35 pounds each. Their combs now contain the heather skep apiarist's entire year's harvest of honey. After the bees have been shaken out at the home farm, the beekeepers will start to break the combs out of the skeps and harvest the honey.